Hello, welcome to In Focus, a gender lens on California policy, hosted by the University of London and Gender Equity Policy Institute. Thank you so much for joining today. We really appreciate you spending your lunchtime with us. And I just want to say that the fact that so many of you are joining us today is a real testament to how California is meeting the moment. I'm Nancy Cohen, CEO and founder of Gender Equity Policy Institute, also known as GEPI. For those of you who don't know us up yet, we're an independent nonprofit research and policy organization based in Los Angeles. We specialize in data-driven research, and we work with California policymakers and advocates to develop practical solutions and policies to advance equity and opportunity for all. Look in the chat for a link to our publications. That'll give you a sense of the scope of our work on a variety of issues, such as climate, housing, labor, and immigration, and to see how the research is translated to a general audience. You can also check out the link to our press page, which you'll also find in the chat. So we have three exciting presentations for you today about how and why to put a gender lens on policy. They'll address one, the problem of gender inequality and how that affects Californians. Two, the solution with a focus on how to tackle gender disparities. And three, we're particularly excited to introduce the GEPI Data Dashboard, a new tool for policymakers featuring interactive, intersectional data visualizations and downloadable data on Californians. So let me preview the presentations before we jump in. In the first one, Dr. Sarah Jane Glynn, VP of Research at GEPI, will dig into the data and the policy implications revealed by new GEPI research on gender imbalances in childcare and work in the home in California. Our co-host and second speaker is Dr. Jennifer Piscopo, Director of the Gender Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. It's not an exaggeration to say that Jen is one of the leading international experts working at the intersection of gender policy and political representation. Earlier this year, GEPI partnered with Dr. Piscopo on a research report, Roadmap for an Equitable Future. That report explores how integrating a gender equality perspective on issues that we don't typically think of as women's issues is now the common global approach to addressing gender disparities. And the report also offers strategies on how this approach can be adapted in the California context. Jen will present key takeaways and cases from this report. Now, everyone here knows, of course, how important good data is to effective policy making, and that's the topic of our third presentation. Natalia Vega Varela, GEPI's policy director, will provide a sneak peek at the GEPI data dashboard, which launches publicly in January. So before we dive in, a couple logistics. Each of the three presentations will run between 8 and 10 minutes. The rest of the time at the end is for questions and discussions. By the way, we'll also be answering questions along the way in writing in the Q&A function, so feel free to pop yours in at any time. A recording of this webinar will be shared with you later, and to allow for open discussion during the Q&A, we're going to turn off the recording before the Q&A starts. I guarantee you we will end by 12:55 so you can get to your next meeting. So with that, I am delighted to introduce Sarah Jane S.J. Glynn. S.J. is a labor sociologist and policy expert with experience conducting research and developing policy at the national, state, and local level. She joined GEPI in August as VP of Research after serving as chief economist in the Biden-Harris Department of Labor. And prior to that role, she was a senior advisor in the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor, where she authored a number of major reports on gender, labor, and economics. We're so happy to have her at GEPI now. SJ, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Like Nancy said, I'm SJ Glenn. Really appreciate you being here, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of our new research. So there are a lot of things that I love about California, and one of them are the huge advances that women have made in the state over the years. Women are the majority of the state's population, the majority of adults with college degrees, and the majority of current college students. But in spite of all these advances, gender equality remains elusive. For example, women don't have access to the same jobs or the same incomes. We know that women in the state are 82% of all nurses, but only 3% of all electricians. And more than half of women renters live in unaffordable housing, which includes 77% of single mothers. So, why do these imbalances persist? It's not just about what happens when people are at school or when they're at work. Another core driver of inequality has to do with what happens when women and men are at home. And we explore this in our most recent report, When Time Isn't on Your Side, Unpaid Work and the Free Time Gender Gap in California. In it, we analyze differences in how women and men spend their time, especially time spent taking care of children and time spent on household work. And this isn't some abstract theoretical topic, which is part of why I care about it so much. It's something that impacts all of our lives directly. So I grew up in Yuba County, which is just a little bit north of where most of you are right now. And that's me in my mom's arms. We were at my dad's graduation from UC Davis. And in our house, when I was growing up, there was a very significant gender divide when it came to the division of labor. My mom, who I do want to say was helped by all of us kids, but she did most of the routine household chores. She did most of the childcare, and she made dinner every night, for example. Meanwhile, my dad, on the other hand, was mostly responsible for things that were much less frequent, like yard work and car maintenance. And nothing about my experience growing up was unique or unusual. That same pattern, where mom does most of the housework and childcare, is still largely what things look like in most families in California today. So, in our report, we used data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics American Time Use Survey, and we compared the amount of time that men and women in California spend on common daily activities. So, this is stuff like taking care of children, cooking and cleaning, doing other household chores and labor, the time people spent at their jobs, their free time, and even things like how many hours people slept. But no matter how we cut the data, we found that women consistently spend more time on housework and childcare than men. And when we look specifically at parents, mothers spend nearly twice as much time as fathers taking care of their homes and their children. And this is the point whenever I'm talking about time data, when people always ask me, wait a minute, SJ, but don't men work longer hours? Isn't this really fair in the end? Aren't families working out a negotiation so that in the end, everybody's doing the same amount? And certainly in some individual cases, that can be true. But as an overall pattern across the nation and within California, that's not the case. So we find that, most women have jobs, including most women in California. Most mothers are employed outside the home. And while it is true that on average men do spend a little bit more time at work, once you add up all of the labor in the day, time spent at a job, time spent doing work around the home, time spent taking care of children, women work more total hours than men. And as a result, there's a free time gender gap, and women have significantly less free time to themselves than men. So when women spend more time taking care of their families and their homes, it means naturally that they have less time for everything else, right? And that includes time for paid work, but also time to invest in their health, in their futures, and in their communities. And this really matters because women have fewer opportunities due to this inequality in the home. But the big question we keep coming back to is, why does this imbalance continue? And one of the reasons is because public policies, even policies that on their face can seem unrelated, often have gendered outcomes. And I've seen this in my own life because, like I told you, I grew up in a family where my mom did most of the childcare and most of the household labor. But that was primarily shaped by outside forces, not my parents' preferences. My mom made dinner every night because my dad didn't get home from work until after 7 p.m. Like I said, we lived in Yuba County, but he worked in South Sac. And he wanted to be home with us more, but we were a big family and it was cheaper for us to live in a rural area. So he ended up with a long commute. Now, both of my parents had jobs, but my dad was our family's primary earner. Why him and not my mom? Well, the GI Bill helped pay for my dad's education. And at that time, My mom only had a high school diploma, largely because she had enrolled in college, but that was before Title IX, and they wouldn't let her take the engineering classes she wanted, so she left. And my mom ended up working as an aide at our school so that she could have a schedule that aligned with us kids. Our family definitely needed the money, but for her to find a better job would have meant that she'd had a different work schedule. So any salary increase that she could have experienced would have been dwarfed by childcare expenses. And that's how it often happens, even today. So I want to be very, very clear about this. The problem is not in doing household labor or childcare. These are valuable and very important pursuits. Caregiving is the foundation of our economy, and it's incredibly important. But it also represents a classic market failure, and our society does not value care anywhere near its true level of importance. And this ends up being a major contributor to gender inequality. The disproportionate caregiving responsibilities that women experience are both a cause and an effect of why the way that they live in the world looks different. The US is one of only a handful of countries in the entire world where women aren't guaranteed paid maternity leave, and the US invests far less in childcare than other comparable economies. Now, California was the first state to offer paid parental leave, and 13 other states have followed suit by passing their own paid leave laws. But the amount of time that's allowed for parental leave in California is still much shorter than what's available in other countries. And it's even shorter than what's available in all but one of the other paid leave states. On top of that, childcare prices in California are among the highest in the nation. And that's in spite of the fact that childcare workers are paid some of the lowest wages in the entire economy. And women don't have to be mothers or to have young children at home to feel these impacts. Women do the majority of all family caregiving, and that includes care for elders and for people with disabilities. And I know myself, there are real joys and real meaning in caregiving, but women still end up paying a price for it in terms of foregone pay, diminished future earnings, and weakened retirement security. But it's not just about economics. Women also have less time, and the time they do have is arranged differently because it so often involves taking care of other people. And this impacts a really broad range of policy areas, even when immediately on its face it doesn't seem related. So, take housing, for example. Housing costs in California are high, and people often end up with one of two options. You can live in a place where there are more good jobs, but probably spend a bigger share of your income on housing and childcare. Or, like my family, you can live where it's cheaper, but that might mean that you end up with fewer job opportunities, lower wages, longer commutes, and less accessible childcare. So it's easy to see how this can create a vicious cycle, especially for women. Or think about transportation. California is a geographically large state and it has a significant car culture. Public transportation is an important tool to help reduce congestion and to reduce emissions, and men and women use it differently. Women are more likely to be traveling outside typical commute times because they're more likely to work in sectors like healthcare where there are non-standard hours. And they're more likely to take multi-stop trips doing things like running errands, often with their kids in tow. But it's still very common for schedules and services to be slanted towards the needs of a 9 to 5 weekday commuter. So, in other words, towards the needs of more men. Or climate policy. Climate disasters don't just ravage our landscapes, they also expose and deepen inequalities. Care work is essential in responding to the needs of people when there are climate disasters like heat waves, fires, and floods. And care is critical to community resilience. Care work is climate work. Think about the Los Angeles fires we had earlier this year. Nearly every school in LA County was closed. And who do you think was most likely to either miss work or have to scramble to find childcare for the 1.3 million students who suddenly had nowhere to go? Our research shows that on a typical day, it's women who are doing the majority of caregiving. And in times of crisis, we know that those imbalances only get more extreme. So, when we center the needs of the folks who are the most vulnerable, we ensure that everyone benefits. But without a gender lens, even very well-intended policies can have negative unintended consequences, like increasing women's unpaid labor or excluding them from opportunities. Integrating a gender perspective can help ensure that this doesn't happen by baking equality considerations in throughout the entire process, from development through implementation. And my colleagues are going to tell you more about the details of taking this approach by sharing real world examples of how this works in practice and sharing concrete tools that'll make it easy to incorporate gender disaggregated data into your work. I know all of you are as anxious to hear from them as I am. So, with that, I will turn it back to Nancy. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, SJ. Um, there's another finding in the report that I want to quickly mention that to me really drives home why gender needs to be explicitly included in equity-driven policy making. Um, we run statistical tests and regressions on all of our data and only report them when they are significant. And when we compared women of different income levels, we found exactly the same pattern of gender disparities. There were no significant differences in time spent on childcare and housework between high income and lower income women. I think what this shows is that gender inequality can be explained solely by or reduced to economics. In other words, the disparities are not just proxies for poverty or income differences or the wage gap. Gender inequality has its own dynamics and underlying causes. So those need to be analyzed, understood, and addressed if we want to advance equity for all the people of California. Which brings us to our next presentation on solutions. While I introduce our next speaker, who will talk about how to do policy to advance intersectional gender equity, you'll see a short poll on your screen. I am honored to introduce Dr. Jennifer Piscopo. Um, Jen is professor of politics and gender at the University of London. Previously, she was a professor of politics and Latino and Latin American studies at Occidental College here in LA. Jen regularly consults to international organizations and national governments, including UN Women and the Organization of American States. She's co-editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender, and her research has been published in over 30 peer-reviewed journals. We are also fortunate at GEPI that Jen serves as senior advisor on global gender policy to us. As I mentioned earlier, Jen will cover key takeaways from the report she co-authored with GEPI. You'll find a link to that in the chat. Jen, welcome and over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm saying good evening because I'm currently joining you from Sweden, so it's a bit late for me, but I'm going to do my best. And my job here is I'm just getting my slideshow queued up. There we go. My job here is to present the report that we at the Gender Institute at University of London co-authored with GEPI on the roadmap for an equitable future, placing a gender lens on American public policy. And what we do in this report is try to understand what are lessons from across the globe in addressing gender equality in public policy that could be adapted to the United States and to California. So we'll start with the big picture. There are a lot of entities that take these gender gaps and try to rank countries by how well countries are doing at gender equality. So there are metrics that look at gender gaps in women's versus men's educational attainment, participation in the formal workforce, access to and representation in politics, and they combine all of these different metrics to then rank countries by those with the smallest gender gaps, meaning the most gender equality across areas like workforce, education, and politics, to those with the least. So the first thing we can see is the US does not do very well in these rankings. The US is far behind its European peers and its Anglophone peers, so Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The US ranks 43rd in the Global Gender Gap Index, which is put out by the World Economic Forum, and 45th in the Gender Inequality Index, which is put out by the United Nations. So, what are other countries then doing better to be ahead of the United States? And their secret is that the vast majority of countries that outrank the United States on these global indexes for gender equality take a holistic approach to thinking about gender equality and policymaking. So each country might call their holistic approach something different, but that's really just a matter of branding. So Canada calls this approach gender-based analysis plus, New Zealand calls it bringing gender in, Sweden, where I'm joining you from right now, calls it gender mainstreaming. But all of these different approaches essentially accomplish the same goal, is that they integrate a gender equality perspective across policy planning. So that means for these countries, gender equality is an important objective for all public policy sectors. And this objective is achieved by ensuring policies across issue areas use data to compare differences between men's and women's experiences and then adapt their public policies to address and close the gender gaps that data has identified. So that might mean using gender equality indicators in program monitoring and evaluation. And these gender equality indicators are also cut by other important identities in society like race and ethnicity. And that's even why Canada calls its approach gender-based analysis plus, with the plus designating an intersectional approach where the gender data is also disaggregated between men and women of different racial and ethnic categories. So I'm talking about countries, but of course, there are many examples across the globe where subnational governments, local governments, city governments, state and provincial governments implement this approach. So I'll give you an example from the sector of transportation, which is under the control of many subnational and local governments. So we know from the transport data that women use public transport more than men. And we also know that women are more likely to use public transport with children, with strollers, with shopping bags. They're sort of managing a lot of items and small children when they're using public transport. So in fact, local governments responded to some of these data about gender differences in transport. So we see examples from local governments commissioning buses, trams, and subway cars with wider doors to accommodate strollers and handbags and lower handrails because women on average are more petite than men. I know as a petite woman, I'm often struggling, right, to grasp that bar to hold myself steady on a metro. And so they lowered those handrails to make them more accessible for women and children. We also see local governments allowing women or women traveling at night to request stops that are along the route, but that are not marked stops in order to shorten the distance that women would have to travel to return to their homes, and designing schedules to take account of women's usage outside of typical commuter times. So hopefully this example illustrates how gender equality considerations in policymaking cut across policy areas. They're not just associated with those policy areas that we think of typically being gendered, such as maternal health or reproductive health, but in fact, we can take a gendered lens to any policy area. And so countries that integrate the gender equality perspective are thinking about gender equality and gender gaps and closing gender gaps for gender equality when they're designing policy, when they're implementing policy, when they're evaluating policy. And the approach, as mentioned, relies on data and is intersectional. I'll offer you a few more examples that we highlight in the report about how these gender equality considerations transform policy. So we talked about transportation, but another important analysis is climate. Another important policy area is climate. So thinking first about what the data says, in Canada, their GBA plus analysis showed that women, Native people, older people, and racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to be impoverished, but were less likely to benefit from existing programs that gave households rebates on green energy upgrades. Because the rebate implies that you first need to go out and purchase the product, right? Put out the money to purchase the product and then do the administrative effort to claim the rebate. So when the gender-based analysis plus showed that these programs were then not being taken up by these groups, they changed the program to make grants, particularly in the areas of greener home and conversion from oil to heat pumps, targeted at lower and middle income households. So the grant would be the initial push that these groups would need to take advantage of the programs. In housing, we highlight the example of the 1997 Women Work City Housing Complex that was Vienna's first gender-responsive housing complex. They actually called it a gender-responsive housing complex. And today, all public housing projects in Vienna must be designed with gender in mind, and some actually designate Vienna as the world's most women-friendly city. So what makes this housing complex gender-friendly, or shows that they took a gender equality perspective when designing the complex? The housing complex has proximity to public transit. It has built-in essential services like kindergartens and primary medical care. It has communal spaces in the center of the housing complex with clear sightlines from apartments, so those who are minding children, most often women, can be in the apartment with a clear line of sight to where their children are playing. and because of ongoing concerns from women and children around safety, especially women who might work different hours, returning home late at night, they have well-lit entryways and passageways. So, how might a gender equality perspective in public policy be piloted by interested state or local governments? So, ways in California that this could be done would be to include gender impact assessments in multi-year housing, transport, or climate plans, collaborate with researchers to analyze gender disaggregated data in specific issue areas, or pilot a gender responsive action plan in a specific policy area, like workforce, transportation, or housing. What I really like about understanding how governments integrate a gender equality perspective is that this perspective produces better outcomes for everyone, not just women. Who doesn't want to live in housing complexes with built-in amenities, close proximity to public transport, communal areas, and well-lit and safe passageways? So, with all of these global examples across the globe, what we propose in the report is why could California not do this too? Thank you so much for your time, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was an amazing survey of the global landscape. Just want to flag for all of you that in the full report, you'll find a number of case studies on three issue areas: housing, financial inclusion, and climate action, as well as best practices for building a successful gender equality perspective strategy here. We can't say it enough. We're always repeating it. A critical component of this work is intersectional gender disaggregated data. And so with that in mind, we're ready to move to our final presentation before the Q&A. And that's a preview of the GEPI data dashboard. When it launches in January, it'll include dashboards on various topics, such as income gaps, rent burden, and occupational distribution by gender, race, and ethnicity, and relevant indicators like age or education. The data will be available at the state level and county levels, and the dashboard will be updated regularly with new topics and data. So take a look at our second and final poll while I introduce our next speaker. It gives me particular pleasure to introduce Natalia Vega Varela, Policy Director at GEPI. Natalia joined us at the beginning of our organization in 2021 after completing her master's in international development. For the past several years, as many of you know, she served as one of the organization's principal data analysts and research leads. For today's webinar, Natalia will demonstrate features of the new dashboard. She's not going to show you all the dashboards up there, and she's going to use energy affordability as the example case. Natalia, over to you.
Hi, I'm Natalia Vega Varela, Policy Director at Gender Equity Policy Institute. I'm here with a demonstration of the GEPI data dashboard. This interactive tool will be available to the public in January 2026. To show how the dashboard works, I'll use energy affordability in California as the example. Topics on the GEPI data dashboard include educational attainment, jobs and wages, housing affordability, and other important issues. Now let's start the demonstration. What you're seeing here is the energy burden dashboard for California. Energy burden is a way to assess if home energy costs are affordable. A person is energy burdened if they live in a household spending more than 6% of household income on energy bills. This first view shows a share of all energy burdened adults in California by gender. First, I want to call your attention to the bottom pane, which provides context on the state's population by gender, household income, and race and ethnicity. Now let's look at the top pane. It shows the share of California adults by gender who are energy burdened. Overall, 19% of adults are energy burdened. By gender, 20% of women and 17% of men are. This is a statistically significant difference. In other words, women are more likely to be energy burdened. Selecting the gender filter, you can see that data can be displayed in 4 ways: total, men, women, and all data. The all data view selected here shows the total for California and the gender breakdown side by side for comparison. Let me take a moment to explain how we derive these findings. Gender Equity Policy Institute analyzed U.S. Census Bureau American Community Survey microdata. Behind the scenes, we code and analyze the data used in the statistical program R to produce results that are disaggregated by gender, race, ethnicity, income, age, and other variables. Our statistical modeling creates thousands of new data points, which the dashboard then turns into the interactive visualizations you see here. The public dashboard is designed to enable users to explore and download the information for their own use. Now that you know where the data comes from, let's explore the filters. We can filter by income. Users can either select a single income level or compare across a full income distribution by selecting all quartiles. The chart now displays results by gender for people at different income levels, from the lowest income quartile to the highest. People in the lowest quartile, whose household income is below $50,000, are the most energy burdened at 61%. Women in this group are more likely to be energy burdened than men. Although the percentages are close, 61 for women and 60 for men, the statistical testing confirms that women are disproportionately burdened. This view also allows you to compare income groups. As you can see, a very small share of upper income people is energy burdened, yet 22% of middle income men and women are. This is shown in the second bar for the second quartile, or Q2. Now let's move on to the filter for race and ethnicity. You can choose any single racial or ethnic group with available data. On this dashboard, the groups shown are Asian, Black, Latino, multiracial, Native American, other race, Pacific Islanders, and white. Selecting all races and ethnicities shows comparisons by gender for all groups with available data. Looking at the data, Black women and Native American women and men experience the highest levels of energy burden in California. A key feature is that the dashboard allows us to statistically compare different groups. For example, it can answer the question, are women more likely to struggle with high energy bills than men of the same race and ethnicity? In other words, we can see whether the difference in the share of energy burden between women and men reflects a real difference. For example, Black women in California are more likely to be energy burdened than Black men, according to the statistical tests we have run in the background. So far, we've been looking at statewide data. The platform also provides a way to look at specific counties. The Select County filter lets you choose from all counties with available data. Note that very small counties are typically not available because the sample size is too small for reliable analysis. Let's select Sacramento County. The chart now shows the same data, the full breakdown of energy burden by race and ethnicity, intersected with gender for the county. It is displayed next to the statewide data to allow you to compare the two. When a county is selected, the demographics table and the race and ethnicity donut chart in the bottom pane also update automatically to reflect the county's population. We can also choose one gender. For instance, we can select men. And you can explore another important comparison. Is a particular group in a county more or less likely to be burdened by the same group at the state level? Let's look at Asian men. You can see there is no statistically significant difference for Asian men in Sacramento compared to the state. But there is a significant difference for Black men. Those in Sacramento County are less likely to be energy burdened than Black men overall in California. Let's go back to selecting all data in the gender filter and looking at California only. There are a couple of additional features worth pointing out. Users have the ability to download the data into Excel or a PDF. Here, I'll download a table of energy burden by gender and race and ethnicity. I will exit from this full screen mode, then go to the bottom of the dashboard and click on the download icon. There you will see the option of crosstab. We will click on it. Because we're interested in downloading the energy burden data, we click on EV chart. As an end, we select Excel. We click download. An Excel file has downloaded and we can now open it. We can see that the file has energy burden data by race and ethnicity intersected with gender in California. We can now close this file and go back to the full screen view of the dashboard. Finally, the bottom banner provides some additional technical information and a sample citation. In closing, to summarize, this energy burden dashboard allows you to view data across California and most counties, with the ability to filter by gender, race, and ethnicity and age group. As I mentioned, this is just one topic on the GEPI data dashboard. And just like with this one, you'll be able to filter by gender and other demographics and easily see where differences are statistically significant. Gender Equity Policy Institute has developed this interactive tool to make data more accessible for policymakers, advocates, and the public. We look forward to seeing how you use the GEPI data dashboard to advance equity for all people. Thank you.